Phoebe was quite a phenomenal CSP student. I think one thing that really struck me as quite interesting is the work she did with Latitude Media, writing a number of really interesting articles this year. And actually, some of those articles were adjacent to like conversations that she and I were having about various topics. So to see somebody be able to write and think in such an organized way about topics that aren't like, oh, climate change is bad. It's like, oh, section 5200A1 of the regulatory paper reduction act is redundant with this other regulation, and because of that we need to go through a new rulemaking process. And Phoebe is somehow able to unpack just the complexities of a lot of this, and I think she has the aptitude to possibly really be an excellent environmental or financial journalist, although she's a little bit sane and down to earth to be a writer. But that's okay. That's okay. And she took an opportunity here to do a project that relates to one of her passions, theater. And I'm just gonna say, there are a number of people out there who are really good at writing songs, and really good at playing the guitar, really good at acting. You don't have to fly around the country to see Bruce for a 72nd time, right? There's a 22-year-old in Carlsbad and Chula Vista and Escondido who's the next Bruce. And there's like, on the Jersey Shore, there's like 100, There's so much undiscovered acting talent in this world, musical talent in this world, that local and regional theater and musicians that you knew and theater productions that you were invested in. How we have someone in this book who wrote a book that was adapted into a play that was shown right in this darn city. And it was a darn good book and a darn good guy. And, I think that we can entertain ourselves more sustainably, and we really should try. And, Phoebe had a great stakeholder here and really looked into operations of a theater in a way that I thought was very interesting. And it's actually going to inspire me probably to try to actually consume media that isn't fed to me by Jeff Bezos or Netflix or Paramount, Warner. I think that's all the media companies, except for Rupert Murdoch's. Phoebe, Greening the Globe, Integrating Sustainability into Regional Theater Productions and Operations. And she'll be our last presentation.
So hello, as Corey said, my name's Phoebe, and I will be concluding our symposium today. And I'll be talking with you about ways to integrate sustainability into theatrical operations and productions. As a way to get started, I just want to tell you what on earth I actually did. So I worked with San Diego's Old Globe Theater to conduct a sustainability audit of their operations and created 3 versions of a guidebook full of actionable, scalable recommendations for greening the theater. There's one version that was created specifically for the Globe with all of their internal data, as well as 2 over 100-page versions that were more general, that are available in both English and French freely online. And while I do want to note that most of my work didn't focus on the Globe specifically, I am going to be highlighting the energy audit that I did with them in just a couple minutes. That said, if you're curious and want to take a look at the English version, feel free. And while you do that, I just want to tell you a little bit about my own personal motivation. Long story short, I grew up a big theater kid, and I think a lot of you know that theater was really my life for a long time, but COVID really changed that. And for the last 4 years, I've just been looking for a way to get back to that passion, as theater has, for me, always been one of the most, it's just always been this escape for me and something that I really crave. And so I guess that does bring up the question, though, why am I really suggesting tying in climate change, which is kind of, one of the most daunting existential crises of our time? Truthfully, I want the arts to not just survive the climate crisis and survive a warming world, but be able to really thrive sustainably. Still, beyond me, why theater? Well, a lot goes into theater making. A lot of time, people, money, effort, and energy. Unfortunately, that means that a lot comes out of theater making too. Carbon emissions, material waste, energy waste, burnout, and so much more. And Honestly, once I knew about all of theater's negative impacts, I knew that I would have a really hard time actually enjoying it if I didn't try to do something about it. I do unfortunately have to tell you everything we're up against and everything that is wrong with theater. From an environmental standpoint, theater is often considered this disposable art form because it produces a lot of waste. And most shows are really not designed with a life beyond closing. So the materials that are created for them, whether costumes or sets or props, they aren't created in a way that makes it easy to reuse them. And so they just end up getting thrown away. And that is really sad, and it creates a lot of waste. Additionally, the theater industry is very energy intensive, and that bumps up both your costs and your carbon emissions. For some perspective, theaters in London alone produce approximately 50,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions every year. Moving on to more of a social and economic standpoint, I think you and I both know that the performing arts are not necessarily known as the most lucrative field. Couple that with your long, irregular working hours and what's often inconsistent employment, it's really hard to actually make a living in the theater industry, particularly as it is also physically demanding, whether you're in front of or behind the curtain. Lastly, I do want to touch on accessibility, as high ticket costs can make theater really economically prohibitive for more of your low and middle income individuals, and that makes your audience less diverse and impedes the cultural growth that can come with viewing theater. I do just want to note that particularly for local and regional theaters, which are really meant to be these gathering spaces for the community and allow you to connect and engage with art in your community. If the theater is only accessible to a certain tier of the community, that really prohibits that. And that's not ideal, and that's really sad. All that is to say is that right now we have the chance to really reshape the performing arts industry to be more sustainable. And this is particularly true as the theater industry remains on the rebound from the COVID-19 pandemic and is really reclaiming its market share. And I do want to note that right now, consumers are really increasingly making their purchasing decisions based on their values. And while this is true across the board, nowhere do we see this clearer than in younger generations who are really coming into their purchasing power and, might I add, are increasingly making up a larger share of audience. Plus, from a financial standpoint alone, sustainable practices really do pencil out. In the long run, going green can save you money and cut back your carbon emissions in one fell swoop. Now I'm going to pivot into my findings and some more general recommendations for how theaters can make their productions more sustainable. I'll be pulling some small excerpts from most of my guidebook chapters, though unfortunately I won't be able to go into too much detail, as I would prefer to give you more a high-level overview of the majority of the theatrical departments rather than go really in-depth on one or two and leave you without the full picture. Starting off with design. Design is this really interesting scenario because your designers have this unique opportunity to really weave sustainability into the heart of a production right from the onset. And so when you do it that way, you don't really notice that you're doing anything differently. You don't notice that you're changing your practices to be more sustainable. That's just how you're going about it. But that can be really impactful, as up to 80% of a production's environmental impact are locked in by decisions that are made during the design process. Still, what does this look like in practice? Well, this could be anything from creating designs that really utilize recycled or previously used items, or those that can be easily broken down into component parts that then can be saved, shared, or recycled. Additionally, drawing on more of your sustainable design strategies, having conversations and asking questions like, oh, how can we actually design for reuse and recyclability, are really easy ways to minimize your materials needed to put on a stellar production. Moving on to more of your scenery, set construction is unfortunately one of the most impactful areas of the theater on the environment. Between you have your carbon-intensive, environmentally degrading materials, really egregious amounts of waste, and a work environment that can be potentially dangerous or hazardous, your scenery does unfortunately have really significant sustainability ramifications and produces the most greenhouse gas emissions of any theatrical department. And so you need to figure out, okay, how can we strike this balance between your cost and your consequence? And that's difficult, and that takes a lot of time. Particularly as certain materials are more sustainable than others, but other materials are usually cheaper. And so figuring out how you actually balance that is hard. That said, that chart from the Theater Green Book is a really quick way to determine kind of a general idea about a material's sustainability. Essentially, this is a carbon emissions hierarchy that considers factors like how and where materials are sourced from, what's their future lifespan look like, are there any toxicity concerns, to rank different materials in terms of their sustainability. And so it just kind of starts out with the idea of actually designing out materials so they aren't used in the first place, being the most sustainable, segues into more of your zero low carbon options, and then continues downward until they get to be really truly unsustainable options. That said, as a general rule, opting for lumber over metal and recycled materials over virgin ones are going to be your best bet. Specifically, your recycled wood, plywood, and certain types of engineered lumber are going to be much better than more like tropical woods or even hardwoods to avoid more of your deforestation-related impacts, but also just toxicity concerns that can come along with those. Along similar lines, water-based paint, which contains lower amounts of volatile organic compounds, is going to be much better for human health. One thing I do want to note that I learned from the Globe was this idea of creating a build, pull, buy list at the start of the construction process. Essentially what this is that whenever a show is decided on, the scenery and prop department will go through the script, write down every single object that could be used in the production, big or small, and then put it into one of those three categories. Is this an item that I need to construct from scratch? Is it something I already have in stock or that can be modified with materials I already have, or is it something I need to buy? And that's just a really easy way to make sure you actually make use of what you already have. Moving on to costumes. The costume department faces more of your different challenges, shall I say, compared to some of the other departments, like scenery or lighting, just because, to paraphrase one of the books that I drew on heavily for this project, a naked actor has a much larger impact on the audience than does a minimalistic set. And so costumes aren't really something that you can avoid. So you just have to figure out, okay, how can we do this a little bit more sustainably? Again, from a design standpoint, this can look like something that reuses or upcycles existing garments, or even uses fabrics from the workshop or whatnot. Additionally, creating a regularly updated, comprehensive database of your costume pieces that you have in stock is a really valuable way to improve your knowledge sharing and also enable designers that might not be in the area to make better use of what you already have, along with figuring out ways to integrate various alteration techniques that can make it possible for garments to be reused more often. I'm just briefly going to touch on the textile angle because unfortunately, very few textiles are truly sustainable. That said, as a general rule, your natural options are going to be your best bets. And specifically, just avoid polyester and any fossil fuel-based fabric. That's going to be your best bet. And organic fabrics are more expensive, but better for human health and the environment. Now, just briefly moving on to lighting. Lighting might have the most challenges of any theatrical department sheerly because of its energy use. You know, like keeping the lights on requires a lot of electricity, and that's not cheap for a theater's wallet or its carbon budget, truthfully, particularly as most theatrical productions occur at night. And that's when, as we've heard earlier today, your electricity is most expensive because that's when there's the highest demand. And unfortunately, as Connor mentioned, that is also when renewable energy drops off. And so you have this really unfortunate combination of really expensive energy with really dirty energy. And so you're paying more to get worse, more polluting electricity. All that is to say is that the lighting department is really then ripe with opportunity. And while most of those effective interventions are really technology-based and could be things like phasing out more of your traditional incandescent bulbs with LED or energy-efficient options, there are certain design changes that you can make, or even behavioral interventions, like assigning someone to be in charge of turning off all the lights at the end of the day, or anything as simple as that, that can really have a big impact, as can things like actually measuring the energy use of individual light rigs to figure out, okay, this light is not actually being used as much as we thought. Can we just get rid of it entirely? Lastly, I'm not going to spend too much time going through stage management or front of house, just because they don't have huge impacts. That said, both of these areas of the theater are very paper heavy, and so incorporating digitization could be a great way to reduce more of the material waste. Now I'm going to pivot to talk about San Diego's Old Globe Theater, with whom I worked to complete my project. This is the Globe. This is the main theater complex, which is in Balboa Park, and the theater produces 15 to 17 shows every year. With the Globe, I conducted an energy audit where I looked at 15-month-long billing periods of their electricity usage to essentially just make some conclusions and whatnot. And while the time of use data in terms of the proportion from on-peak to off-peak versus super off-peak wasn't extremely informative, you do see this really clear seasonality to the data, where, as you can see with this chart, the electricity usage really does peak in the summer months. They're around July and August and whatnot. And this can be attributed to a couple of factors. One, we all know that it's hot in the summer, especially in San Diego, and so your air conditioner use is going to go up because, one, no one wants to be hot and sweaty in the theater. That's not any fun. But two, there's a lot of machinery in the theater that does need to be kept cool just for safety reasons like lights and whatnot. And so that bumps up your electricity usage. The Globe also hosts this annual summer theater festival during those months, which then means that simply more of the theater complex is in use at one time, and that also just bumps up your electricity usage. Why do we care? Well, at least in San Diego, electricity costs more during the summer. And so when you use more energy, when it is more expensive, that's going to raise your electricity bills. And for the Globe, that is to the tune of doubling their electricity bills from January to July, to the tune of paying almost $20,000 a month for the main theater campus, just in electricity. And that doesn't include the technical center, which is where all of the scenery and the sets are built, which is a 40,000 square foot building in southern San Diego, just for some perspective. This is only the main theater. And so you have that aspect. It's just expensive. But from an emissions standpoint, the main theater complex's electricity usage every year creates approximately 327,000 kilograms or 327 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And this is equivalent to burning over 360,000 pounds of coal or driving nearly 850,000 miles in a gas-powered vehicle. While this doesn't sound as severe as some of the other impacts we've talked through today, this doesn't include anything except for the electricity usage. It doesn't include gas or heating or transportation or any of the other emissions that could really go into it, nor anything from the technical center. And so it is a useful proxy measure, but it's not as informative as I would have liked. However, with the data that was available, this was what we came to. In terms of my recommendations, well, changing the time of use would be ideal when possible to kind of shift away from some of that on-peak usage. That isn't very realistic, considering that the theater industry is really built on this idea of having your shows in the evening or on the weekend. And if you are a theater that strikes out from that, realistically, you're probably not going to be very profitable, particularly if the rest of the industry doesn't come along with you. So while that would be ideal, it's not as feasible. That said, integrating a solar array or a solar and storage hybrid system at the main theater campus would actually be really particularly impactful. The Technical Center in December installed a solar array that has already been decreasing their electricity usage by electricity purchase from the grid by 34% every month, and is really decreasing their costs. But this isn't at the main theater complex. And integrating that solar and storage combination would be a really valuable combination, not only for the Globe, but for theater overall. Because essentially what a system like that would enable is the theater during the day could take in a bunch of renewable energy, store it in their battery when there's not very much going on at the theater. And then during performances, which also just happen to be during the peak usage time and when electricity is dirtiest, spit it back out so then they, A, don't have to pay for electricity drawn from the grid, and B, they avoid drawing that dirty electricity in the first place. And so it makes it easier to power your shows more sustainably. Just wanted to briefly say a big thank you to my committee members and everyone else who supported me through the process. Thank you all for coming today, and if you would like to take a look at any of the other versions or learn a bit more about the project, feel free to take a look at the website. But yeah, any questions? Thank you so much. That said, I'm sure you all are hungry, so.
Thank you, Phoebe. I'm curious if you thought about like the kind of the lifetime of such a guide, because you talked about like material and stuff. Like, is it something you thought about, and would you do like, I don't know, like a update or other versions?
Realistically, I think it would be possible to update certain sections, such as, like, for example, with the lighting section, I have a subsection that's all about like different softwares that you can use. I think for sections like that are just really more technical focused of like, here are some programs that you can use, I think that would be a valuable section to update. That said, the majority of the materials that are used in theater have been used for so long, and it's not like there are new materials being created every day. You know what I mean? And so the general principles would stay the same. And so while I could theoretically do more like minute updates, and I would love to go back and do more. I would love to honestly go back and add a section that had more of the qualitative data I gathered from the 10 interviews I did. But in terms of the specific recommendations, I don't know how much it would change.
Has the, excuse me, has the globe already changed to LED-based lighting?
They have, yes. Yeah.